Here we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for April 5, 2022. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, President of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He's led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that have met with the legislative, executive, intel, and military leadership of those countries. Also, as president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long experience conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for your work with the Washington Times Foundation. Today, our program is going to discuss the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the impact on the world order, the challenges to such. Our moderator today is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. He's the former special envoy for negotiations with North Korea and the former director of National Counterproliferation Center. Ambassador DeTrani is also a former associate director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and special advisor to the DNI. Prior to that, he was a senior official in the Central Intelligence Agency. On our panel today is Ambassador Robert Joseph. We're honored to present Ambassador Joseph, who's a senior scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy in Fairfax, Virginia, where they are examining prospects and requirements for deterrence success in the contemporary security environment, non-proliferation strategies, the future of U.S. relations with China and Russia, and the role of strategic defenses and nuclear weapons in U.S. and national security policy. He's former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security for Special Envoy and Special Envoy for Proliferation. In the aftermath of 9/11, Ambassador Joseph served on the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Proliferation Strategy. Dr. Joseph was also the founder and director of the Center for Counterproliferation Research at the National Defense University in Washington. Mr. Guy Taylor is National Security Team Leader for the Washington Times News Organization. He is an award-winning foreign correspondent currently overseeing the Times State Department and intelligence community coverage. Mr. Taylor has engaged extensively in international reporting over the last 20 years, from Latin America to the Middle East to the Asia Pacific. His exhaustive coverage of U.S. policy towards North Korea crisis has won accolades from across the political spectrum. His reporting on security, political, and economic developments in Mexico won the Virginia Press Association Award. And his reporting on Russia attempts to influence the 2016 election was recognized by the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for distinguished reporting. And our special panelist, our guest speaker for today, is Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. Our special guest is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General, very, very well known in leadership in America on security and on defense, and also how America might remain strong. He's been a contributor to Fox News, appearing almost nightly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He previously served as the National Security Advisor to Vice President Michael Pence and as Executive Secretary and Chief of Staff of the United States National Security Council. General Kellogg joined the Army in '67, served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. During Operation Desert Shield's Desert Storm from 1990 to 1991, General Kellogg served as the Chief of Staff for the 82nd Airborne Division. General Kellogg retired from the Army in 2003 after becoming Lieutenant General and serving as Director of Command, Control, Communications, and Computers for U.S. forces under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During his military career, he earned the Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star, and several Bronze Stars. He earned his BA in Political Science at St. Clara University and an MS in International Affairs from the University of Kansas. General Kellogg went on to study senior level management and diplomacy at the Army War College. I will turn this over now to our moderator, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Joe?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Michael Jenkins. It's an honor being here with you and this distinguished panel and our distinguished guest, General Kellogg. Let me just say special thanks to the Washington Times Foundation for hosting these monthly webinars that discuss some very, very important international issues, indeed that affects the security of all countries, with the focus often on North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. Today, however, we're going to open it up and talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February and the devastation it's caused to the country of Ukraine, with the millions of refugees who fled the country, with the total devastation of major cities in Ukraine, and the killing of thousands and thousands of innocent people. And we've just seen some footage of the massacres in Bucha and some other locations just over the past few days. We'll talk about Ukraine and its Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it's done, but also the international condemnation of Russia. And Russia now is a pariah state facing significant sanctions. But there are a few countries that have not condemned Russia. One of them is China. We'll talk a little about China and its relationship with Russia and what it means for China that deals very closely with the European country nations, where they do most of its trade, over $800 billion a year with those European nations, and certainly with the United States, over $600 billion a year. And another country we'll mention today is also North Korea, that has not condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And North Korea recently launched over 12 missiles, most recently an intercontinental ballistic missile that's possibly even capable of delivering multiple nuclear warheads. We'll talk about all these issues today with this distinguished panel. But first, I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, General Kellogg. And as Dr. Jenkins indicated, what a distinguished career this man has had, and certainly most recently as the the senior advisor to, but indeed the national security advisor to the Vice President of the United States, Michael Pence. So over to you, General Kellogg, for your comments, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. And I appreciate being here with you all today. Look, what I'm going to do is when I make my comments today, I'm kind of putting my hat on as I would when I was a national security advisor to the vice president and when I was on the National Security Council as the chief of staff, and relying on the experience I had in the military as well. The world has changed dramatically since the invasion started on the 24th of February. Most people, I believe, experts as they were, thought that by 1 March, this incursion by the Russians that President Biden said was going to be okay, a limited incursion, turned into something entirely different. And it's a result, honestly, of because of the Ukrainian military performance on the ground against the Russian invasion, but also because of the personality of President Zelensky. You know, when Zelensky made the comment to the world after the United States offered to him a ride out of Kyiv back to the west to Lviv, he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." It captured the world. It was almost a Churchillian comment. And since that time, Zelensky has kind of proven himself to be a reincarnate of Winston Churchill and how he has galvanized the nation and expressed his desire to fight, and his military has fought. You know, there's an old saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And you're clearly seeing that with the Ukrainian military and the way they have actually pushed back the Russian military, and they're outnumbered on a 10-to-1 level. You know, I thought back on that, and I remember meeting President Zelensky in Warsaw in 2019 with Vice President Pence. And I remember sitting down, listening, and he'd just been elected. And I said, you know, this is the kind of guy you can have a beer with. He was really a pretty good guy, really understood it. And at that time, we were sent there with a mission. And that was where we were actually withholding a little bit of military aid from President Trump. Of course, we know what the reaction to that was later with an impeachment. But the real reason we were holding it back was because we were concerned about corruption. Because before that, we had Poroshenko, and we have a new president. And we said, get a feel for the guy. President Trump was supposed to be there. He wasn't because of the hurricane that hit the southern part of the United States. We went there and we came out of there and we said, this is a guy we can work with. And he has proven that today in his leadership of Ukraine. Why this is important, and I think this is important for all of us to understand in what is seen in global dynamics with Ukraine and what they're doing with Russia. Because what has happened is it's changed the entire dynamics, I believe, of the relationship between Russia and the rest of the world, but also the global implications of it as well. And what I mean by that is escalation dynamics. You know, when you look at what's happening, we're now having nuclear power, Russia, being faced with three nuclear powers, the United States, Great Britain, and France. And there's a little bit of concern about escalation because the Russians do have nuclear weapons. And I saw that with President Biden, when President Biden now wanted to help transfer those MiG-29s, which would have assisted and still would assist the Ukrainians in their fight against Russia because of the escalation dynamics with the Russians. And what I mean by that is with the Russians, they have a military philosophy and a strategy of what they call escalate to de-escalate. And the concern is, what do they mean by escalation to de-escalate? Is it going to be a chemical? Is it going to be biological? Is it going to be nuclear? And you can use small weapons, and they've got them. We don't have the type they've got. They're sub-kiloton nuclear weapons. Ours stay at the kiloton and megaton range. We used to have sub-kiloton weapons. We used to have a system called the Davy Crockett, which was used on battalion level groups. We took those out of the inventory in the 60s, primarily because the general thought was we would prefer World War III not be started by a sergeant on the battlefield. But the Russians have got that, and they intend to use them if necessary to escalate, to de-escalate. So is Putin thinking about that? Is he going to do something like that? And I think that is playing in the dynamics that you see with President Biden right now when he looks at what's happening on the battlefield. And I don't think anybody thought that the Ukrainians would perform as well as they did. I know our military leadership didn't, because Chairman Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, made the comment that Kyiv would fall within 3 days. Well, we're into 40 plus days later. Kyiv is still standing, and they've actually pushed the Russians back. But what it's proven to me on escalation dynamics is one of the first things we need to consider is, what is that showing to the rest of the world? What it's showing, if you have a nuclear weapon, then everybody changes their attitude about how you are going to perform against that opponent. So right now we are performing one way against the Russians. Well, to put that in the back of your mind, what happens if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, or the expansion of nuclear weapons in North Korea? Will that change how we will react to the North Koreans? Will that change how we're going to react to the Iranians? Will that change how the entire Middle East is going to be reacting to them developing and doing a breakout into nuclear, breaking out into the nuclear threshold? And it's something we all have to have in the back of our mind. So when you look at this about escalation, my concern is now what's going to happen with the miscalculation. And the miscalculation now is where I think we're at when it comes to dynamics of the Ukraine is, okay, by continuing to pushing the fight that the Ukrainians are going to do, what will Putin do going forward as the leader of Russia? People are saying, and I'm using what President Macron said recently in a Wall Street Journal article, was quoted as, he said, Putin has changed dramatically over the last couple of years, been much more isolated. He's not getting the same advice he'd gotten before. I was on 18 different phone calls with President Putin and President Trump. And I will tell you that his attitude to me has changed over the last couple of years. And I feel part of that is you have to go back in history and kind of say, how did we get to where we're at today? You know, when the Ukraine declared their independence in 1991, we all thought, okay, it would be a relatively peaceful change. What we didn't realize is when you have somebody like Putin, he thought that was a continued bad move, because his biggest concern was the breakup of the Soviet Union when it fell apart. He thought that was the greatest disaster that befell Russia probably since World War II. And since the 2007 Munich Security Conference, when he made extreme language about NATO encroachment moving to the east, nobody really took him seriously. And I remember Bob Gates coming back, and he reports that in his book Duty that he wrote after he left the administration. And he talked to President Obama and Vice President Biden, and he said, we have tremendously miscalculated Russia, how bad they feel, how they're feeling about the expansion of NATO, and that miscalculation is going to cause us problems in the future. Well, we're in the future, and we're there with the miscalculation with how we are looking and working with Russia. And my concern on the future, the next miscalculation is, are we going to do something that is going to cause us problems in the next year or 2 years? And I think that should be on President Biden's mind when he makes his comments. Saying that, I prefer President Biden not make comments like he's been making right now about calling Putin a war criminal. I think it's a huge mistake. I go back to what President Trump, when we were sitting in the Oval Office, when he would talk about leaders, adversaries, not friendly leaders, because when we talked about friendly leaders, he could be pretty harsh on them. In fact, I was actually in the room when he hung up on President Merkel, which I said, okay, that kind of ends that conversation. But he would be very circumspect when he was talking about, be it Kim Jong-un or Xi or President Putin as well. He said, you have to watch your language as a leader. And for most people, they wouldn't believe he would think like that, but he did. And you can't walk those comments back with President Biden. And now there's no chance of the United States, I believe, being a good intermediary or interlocutor to go to peace talks. And in fact, I can't find anybody out there right now, unless it's President Niinistöä of Finland, that will help us get out of the current issue with Ukraine and Russia. And they've both drawn very hard lines. So where this ends, we don't know. But the peaceable potential of this is not real high. And this goes back to where Russia's concerns about what they call the near abroad, which they looked at as the former Warsaw Pact countries, what they see with Ukraine. And now that Ukraine has basically defeated the main attack of Russia, and they have defeated the main attack of Russia, they're now in plan C instead of plan A and plan B. And what will the Russians do? I don't think they get the chance of them taking Ukraine is now gone. They cannot move all the way to the west simply because it's so large. People forget when they talk about Ukraine how large it is. It's the second largest country in Europe. And the Russians don't have the capacity or the capability now to go to the west. They've used their best frontline units, their VDV or their airborne units, their best tank units, and most of them have been hurt pretty badly. The main effort failed, trying to take Kyiv and decapitate the government, in other words, change the leadership. And now they're focused in on the east, and that will not be a victory. So it's a loss to Putin. And how is he going to accept that? Or will he continue to ravage those cities to the east? And then how is a negotiator going to end this fight? And it will end at some point, and hopefully it'll end through some type of negotiation. But both have drawn very hard lines, and the U.S. is now out of it. And what I remind everybody, the reason I'm saying the President Biden is out of it, that means we now sit on the back seat because Putin will not listen to President Biden. He will not consider him to be any part of the negotiations. You know, when we were with President Trump, when we were working with the Taliban, President Trump at that time said we ought to bring the Taliban back to Camp David. Well, I was in the Situation Room when he made the comment, and I think probably half the room fell on the floor. I know that my jaw nearly hit the table. But then I thought, wait a second, that's exactly what President Carter did with Menachem Begin of Israel and Anwar Sadat from Egypt when he brought him back to Camp David, put him up there, and for 12 days they negotiated, and they came out with the famous Camp David Accords. So I was thinking that this was an opportunity maybe for President Biden to say, I can be the interlocutor of the free world and bring him back and try to solve this. The second part of it, we keep talking about NATO. This is no longer a NATO issue. This is a European issue. They are going to have to address this themselves because it's so important to what happens within the European environment. And the reason I say that is because economically, they're the ones that are most affected by it, not the United States of America. And economically affected primarily because of power, because of energy. When you look at between 40 and 60% of the energy that flows into Western Europe comes out of Russia, they're going to have to wean themselves off that if they're very serious about it. One country so far has said they're going to do that, followed by two other countries right after that. Of course, those countries are not Germany, they're not France, they're not Hungary, they're Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Well, they don't count for much, but Lithuania was at least the first ones to do it, where they're not going to take any more natural gas that is coming out of Russia. That's what the European countries are going to have to do if they really want to make an impact, because sanctions take a while to bite. And even though we've employed the sanctions, a lot of the Russians are not being affected by it yet. It'll take time for them to do it. And in that time, you've got that concern about what is going to happen in the military environment with Russia and its generals and senior leadership. Right now, we don't know. And the reason we don't know that is because they're not taking our phone calls. Right now, Milley has tried to talk to Gerasimov, his counterpart and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Russia. He's not picking up the phone. Shoigu, the Secretary of Defense for Russia, is not picking up the phone and talking to Secretary Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense. That's dangerous. Now, we know the red line is still working, but that has not been used at all. It's just the normal course of communications between our leadership and their leadership has broken down. And I think that's something we should all be very concerned about, because that also builds into miscalculation. And when you've got nuclear powers facing each other, a nuclear miscalculation at even the smallest level could be really, really dangerous for the rest of the world. Because even though they may use a nuclear weapon at a quote a tactical level, I've never believed that there is such a thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. I think they're all strategic, but they believe in a tactical nuke. So where it comes down to also presidential decision making. And this is where I think I'm very concerned about our president and the misread by Putin has of President Biden. Because one thing Biden has done is he's part of still the Obama administration when a lot of things were said or done that were not followed through on. And let me use just one example, the example of the Syrians. When Syrians were getting ready to use nerve gas, President Obama at the time told them that was going to be a red line that if crossed, the United States would take action. The vice president, of course, was Joe Biden. Well, they crossed that red line by using sarin nerve gas in Damascus, killed over 1,000 civilians. No action was taken. Now, fast forward to President Trump, when there was a similar episode where they used sarin nerve gas, only killed about 100. We responded with around 60 Tomahawk land attack missiles into the airfield. In fact, the president pushed back on Secretary Mattis when he asked the question, why did we not target the Russian commander that was on that airfield? Because he was actually the one who was coordinating the use of the chemical strikes. And of course, people said that would be too escalatory, but President Trump said maybe we should have done it. I mean, he also probably wanted to put one through Assad's front door as well. But the point was the action was different. And so Putin has misread this. And I think he's misreading the will of the president of the United States, at least I hope he is. And he has done that because of the past history that he has seen. So all of these dynamics are in play. You've got your economic dynamics in play with the sanctions. You've got your military dynamics in play with how we are supporting Ukraine and how well they are fighting, much better than we had thought they were going to fight. And you're looking at the diplomatic piece of it, where we're trying to find somebody, I know we are trying to find somebody who can be the interlocutor. It's not going to be Macron of France. He has gone there multiple times, but Putin has kind of pushed him back. It's not going to be Erdogan of Turkey. I think that's a mistake because Erdogan has his own agenda. It's not going to be Prime Minister Bennett of Israel. So the question is, who is it going to be? And I've said, as I said earlier, the one I would have pulled out of if I could have is President Niinistö of Finland, because at least he has some relationship with Putin. He understands him, and Putin knows him from playing actually hockey against him. But Finland has also had a similar episode in the life against the Soviet Union, much like Ukraine has back in 39 and 40 with the Russo-Finnish War. And Finland has been an online country. And this is something that probably we'll have to go to with Ukraine. But right now we're not there at all. And one of the last things I'll say is the concern I've got is on miscalculations by words. I would prefer that the senior leaders of the United States not say anything. And you can say something, and I can say something on the news, or any announcer can, but the President of the United States carries a lot more weight, and he shouldn't be talking about it. And you haven't seen a lot of other world leaders making the same comments. They're concerned about war crimes, but they've not accused Putin of being a war criminal, much like President Biden has. You haven't seen that from Macron. You haven't seen it from Boris Johnson. You haven't seen it from Olaf Scholz of Germany. They complain about war crimes, and there are war crimes. There's no doubt about it, what the Russian military is doing. But you don't attribute that to the leader of a nation because we haven't had any method to deal with that. The International Court in The Hague will not probably pick that one up at all, and no other court will. So you've just broken those lines of communication going forward. So I think what's happened is you've got somebody out there that has become very, very isolated. And I used to say many times before, when you're talking about somebody like Putin, because he is the one who's actually leading this effort on the part of Russia, is the mistake we make as Americans, and I've said it repeatedly. And I said this when I was in the White House as well, we do not understand sometimes how foreign leaders think and work. And there was an old Chinese strategist that goes back to 500 BC who wrote a book called The Art of War, Sun Tzu. And I had to study that as a second lieutenant, and still being told, we're still, young officers are being told to read this on the reading list that they're supposed to be reading as they become professional officers. And in his book, Sun Tzu says, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win all of your battles. If you know yourself, but if you don't know the enemy, you will win only half your battles. If you don't know yourself or your enemy, you will lose them all. And people don't understand, I believe, President Putin or where he's coming from in his level of grievances against NATO moving to the West. I had a very, very talented woman I brought in on the National Security Council, a young woman by the name of Fiona Hill, who was out of Brookings, and she was not a Trump supporter at all. But I wanted the best person I could have that knew Putin, and we brought her in. And she said, the biggest thing I worry about is miscalculation on understanding Putin. Putin does not understand the West. The furthest west he went when he was in the KGB was into East Germany. And he doesn't understand our way of thinking or how we do business. And it will make a mistake or a miscalculation. And that's where I'm afraid we're at today, is potentially having some type of mistake or some type of miscalculation. I don't see this thing ending in the near term, meaning a week from Tuesday. I think this is going to carry on. I think the Ukrainians are going to fight very hard, and the Russians are going to push back as well. And I'm looking for the interlocutor to finally wind this thing down. I don't see one that's out there. And as long as this goes on, and every day that it goes on, somebody should be aware that one of these mistakes is a miscalculation by somebody to do something really stupid, which will escalate this in the eyes of the world. And with that, sir, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, General Kellogg. That was outstanding. There's a lot there to unpack. Very, very powerful comments. We're very fortunate to have Ambassador Bob Joseph with us, the former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Ambassador Joseph, General Kellogg mentioned escalate to de-escalate. He mentioned tactical nuclear weapons. And not much of a difference between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, the possibility of nuclear proliferation, the possibility of miscalculation. Also mentioned the need for an interlocutor, possibly, and he mentioned the number of possibilities. I'll mention even Xi Jinping, given that relationship China has with Russia. Bob, you have this rich background. We would appreciate your comments on all of the above and anything else you want to share with us. Thank you.
Ambassador DeTrani, thank you very much. I will return to the issue of escalation. Let me say at the beginning, though, on that point, that it has long been characterized by the West as escalate to de-escalate. My experience with the Russians, which goes back a good number of years into the Cold War, days of the Soviet Union, they don't think about escalate to de-escalate. They think about escalate to win. It's a hard calculation that they make. And if they feel that they must win, they will resort to whatever capability they have and use that capability to achieve victory, not to achieve simple de-escalation. They don't think like we think. They don't think in those type of action, reaction, escalate, de-escalate. They think about using hard power to win. And I think I certainly take into consideration what General Kellogg has said about the risks of escalation. about the risks of miscalculation. And I think that is a subject that we hopefully can get into. But let me first say that it's a privilege to join such distinguished colleagues for our discussion today, the discussion of the impact on the world order of Russia's war in Ukraine. General Kellogg, thank you very much for a terrific presentation, truly excellent. I learned a lot from it. And of course, let me also thank you for all of your many contributions to our nation's security, both when you were in uniform and after your retirement from the Army. You are exemplary American patriot, and I do have the utmost respect for you. Today, the world's attention is, of course, focused on Putin's war in Ukraine, bringing both heartbreaking images of civilian deaths and inspirational images of Ukrainian resistance fighting the Russian invaders. I think this may be a transformational event, one that could change the course of history, not just in Europe, but well beyond, as we can no longer escape the reality that there is evil in this world without regard to the idealism of the rules-based international order. Some fundamental changes are already apparent. As many others have noted, there is more unity within the NATO alliance than there's been in the last 40 years, going back to the deployment of INF missiles in countering Soviet SS-20s in the late 70s and early 80s. Key NATO members such as Germany have stated their intention to devote more resources to rebuilding their armed forces, meeting, if not exceeding, the 2% GDP goal. Perhaps equally significant is the shift away from strategic dependence on Russian oil and gas. Who could have foreseen the German Green Party leader expressing a willingness to reconsider nuclear energy? Perhaps I'm being overly optimistic, but I believe these changes will last well beyond the end of the deadly conflict in Ukraine. It will be difficult to forget or forgive Russia's war crimes, including the mass executions of civilians in Bucha. Other fundamental changes seem likely. For example, despite the economic risks, Beijing's unwillingness to condemn or even criticize Moscow's invasion and China's assistance to Russia's military effort point to an enduring threat from their strategic collaboration, especially in the Asia-Pacific and perhaps specifically with regard to the future of Taiwan. If Russia prevails in Ukraine, whatever prevail may mean, President Xi's appetite for taking Taiwan will only grow, as Taiwan is key to China's goal of replacing the United States as the preeminent power in the Asia-Pacific. When it comes to the possible proliferation consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine, I personally have two potentially stark concerns. First, and most obvious, for states like North Korea and Iran, the attack on Ukraine will reinforce the perception that security guarantees have no value and that giving up their nuclear weapons program will make them vulnerable to attack. Leaders from both Pyongyang and Tehran have often cited the Libya example in this regard, observing that Gaddafi gave up his program and was overthrown and killed 8 years later in the context of the US-led intervention in the Libyan civil war. While this is certainly a convenient talking point and self-justification for their own programs, it may still be a factor in their calculations. To be clear, North Korea and Iran have nuclear weapons programs for multiple reasons. And their talking points on Libya and in the future, likely Ukraine, need to be seen in that wider context. Both want nuclear weapons for intimidation, for coercion, and to support their aggression in the region. Yes, both also want nuclear weapons for deterrence, but less to deter an attack on them than to deter others from countering their aggression and to deter Western intervention in a future civil conflict when their people rise up against the regime. As for my second concern, I believe that the failure of the security guarantees given to Ukraine, primarily the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, may erode confidence in the US nuclear guarantees in the eyes of our key friends and allies. The US nuclear commitment to our allies has been, in my view, the single most important non-proliferation tool going back decades in both Europe and Asia. But commitments need to be backed by capabilities. While the Biden defense budget does support the recapitalization of the strategic triad, our ICBM, SLBM, and heavy bomber force, it has canceled the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, which was of great importance to Japan, and has objected to the low-yield warhead on our nuclear missile submarines. These are the two weapon systems specifically identified in the previous nuclear posture review as essential for extended deterrence to assure our allies of the nuclear guarantee. If we fail to assure our allies our security commitment and specifically of our nuclear guarantee, they may well seek their own nuclear weapons capability. In Asia alone, this could include South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, all of which could quickly acquire a nuclear capability whenever they choose to do so. So enough of my views. General, I have two questions for you. First, do you share my concerns about the proliferation consequences stemming from the war in Ukraine? Are we now at the gateway, perhaps, for a world of 20 or 25 nuclear weapon states, as President Kennedy predicted in 1963, almost 60 years ago? A world that would fundamentally alter how the US pursues its national security interests in 5 or 10 years from today. And second, as you know, there has been a lot of talk and even some not so thinly veiled threats about the possible employment of chemical and even nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine. What do you think are the prospects that this might actually happen? And if it does happen, what do you think would be the response of this administration, given that it has been very, in my view, perhaps overly concerned about escalation? Because remember, escalation can come not just from provocative actions, but also from weakness. And I would quote no other than President Putin on this: weakness is provocative. And if we show weakness to Mr. Putin, that could be the key that leads us to further escalation. I'll stop there and look forward to your responses. And again, thank you for a terrific presentation.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me take the last one first. My concern is not necessarily with Russians using nuclear. My concern is them using chemical. And the reason I say that, it's in their DNA. DNA meaning that's what they've used against their opponents. Putin has, when you look at somebody like Navalny and others out there, they've used it. They supported the Syrians in their use of sarin nerve gas, a nerve gas that was developed by the Nazis in World War II and was so horrific that even the Nazis didn't use sarin. But my concern is they'll use it because it disperses more rapidly. The world is kind of accustomed to that. They've seen nerve gas used and to do it, and it's more than anything else to shock it. So my concern wouldn't be the chemical, would be the chemicals, not necessarily the nuclear, because they don't want to cross that threshold that was crossed in 45. I don't believe so. But you have to understand, this is how I believe Putin thinks. I think you're absolutely right on the concern about escalation. We shouldn't be concerned about escalation. We should be able to respond to it instead of sitting back and being, well, if we do this, they're going to do this and escalate. We should just ignore that and see what he's going to do and then respond to that. And then if he does use chemicals, he may use it on a demonstration, but if he uses it on on a civilian area, I mean, not only is this nation a pariah nation, but I really believe that if that happens, that you may see some type of action within his own FSB, his intelligence services, or even as generals when they just said, well, this thing is going too far, too fast, and it's out of control. As to proliferation, this is exactly why the president and President Trump wanted to, when they got out of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, it was concerned on this whole issue of proliferation. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, what does that mean for the Saudis? The Saudis will go out and buy one, or the UAE is going to go out and buy one. And his concern is you'll have these proliferation throughout these nations. And then we all now see what happens if you have a nuclear weapon, what happens with everybody's mindset. They just are almost paralyzed to be able to take some type of tough reaction. The part of the reason we were able to act so hard against North Korea is because we have the GBI, the interceptors that were facing North Korea, that we believe we could take out most of the ICMs that would be coming our way from North Korea with the GBIs. We don't have that anywhere else in the world. And so now you have to kind of look at, okay, where could these things come from? If it comes from Iran, then you've got a whole new, a whole new issue that you're facing. So it was two great points you brought up about proliferation, the biggest concern. If it happens out there in the world, should be aware of that, and also the Russian response. And I do think Mike is concerned. I don't think they'll use biological, but I think if I had to put it in an order, I think they'll use chemical, they'll use nuclear, and then they use biological, because the chemical disperses so rapidly, and they've used it before. It's in their DNA, and I don't think they care about it.
Thank you, General Kellogg. And Ambassador Joseph, thank you for your excellent remarks and outstanding questions and your responses, General Kellogg. Look, Ambassador Joseph talked to Guy Taylor, our senior national security reporter for the Washington Times, who just does outstanding work. I read him all the time, and he's right on the mark. A lot of points that Ambassador Joseph just made, certainly that touches the whole question of security assurances. And if they don't mean very much, what does that mean when we negotiate with countries like North Korea? And if indeed he's correct, and we see other countries seeking nuclear weapons like Iran pursuing them, but he mentioned South Korea, Japan, possibly Taiwan, and others, a nuclear arms race. So there is so much to discuss on those points he made. But for you, Guy Taylor, given your rich background, please, any of your comments, but I would like you to also possibly mention, what is it, from where you sit, what is the likelihood of bringing this war to an end so that we don't see any more devastation, killing of innocent people, and what we've just seen at Bucha? Do you see any possibility for resolving it? How do you see that being resolved? And anything else you want to share with us, given your very unique background, Guy? Over to you, Guy.
Wow. Well, thanks, Joe. What an honor to be in this company as a panelist, not just as the journalist in the group. With regard to where we're going from here, I think I tend to see it the way the head of Ukrainian military intelligence last week said, which was that his view or his read of intel on Putin's motives right now are that we're moving towards, or that Russia wants to create a dynamic akin to North and South Korea, where the conflict can be frozen and eventually Russia can sort of consolidate its gains in the east of Ukraine. How we get there quickly, I think it really, really remains to be seen. I think things remain incredibly fluid, dangerously so, with horrific images coming. This reminds me of the early months of the Syrian war, still now, with the execution style killings, images of them and videos peppering through the global media space. So I think we have a long way to go to get there. I just want to offer a couple of thoughts from my own reporting in the last couple of weeks, and then I'll try to quickly bring it to a question for the group here. The first thing, actually, I want to say, General Kellogg, I really appreciated your reference to Fiona Hill's point that Putin doesn't understand the West. I would actually posit that a similar point can be made with regard to U.S. Foreign policy professionals or the U.S. foreign policy establishment. and China, that Washington really doesn't understand China. Ambassador Joseph, I appreciated your comments about the implications of Russia's actions in Ukraine vis-a-vis China-Taiwan dynamics. I think that's a pretty interesting situation there, and I want to get to that quickly, but I also want to emphasize how important the future is to any discussion like this. I fear the US establishment tends to be obsessed with the past in these situations when it's really the future that matters most. And, you know, right now, I do think that conventional wisdom is that, or it seems to be, that the Ukraine crisis pushes China and Russia together, as if somehow a deal was made in which China agrees to parrot Russian propaganda and stand by Russia's actions in exchange for some kind of a promise from Russia to do the same for China if and when it decides to use force to take Taiwan next year or the year after. I don't know. I would actually argue, though, that in reality, the future looks quite a bit more complicated than that right now, as we see Russia bogged down in Ukraine. And then from a broader view, I think it's important for us to note what's been going on around Ukraine for the past decade or so, away from this sort of really biting US domestic political argument about Ukraine and Trump and Biden and impeachment and all these, and Hunter Biden. Actually, China has spent the past decade or so signing Belt and Road investment deals with everyone in the region, including nearly all of the NATO countries to the west of Ukraine. China has emerged as a far more dynamic trade partner with all of them than the EU and Germany and in most cases, the United States. It's also emerged as Ukraine's top trading partner. It's also Russia's top trading partner. And Beijing is really expanding economic influence in the region. Ukraine has the second largest known natural gas reserves in Europe, second to Norway. We can reasonably speculate that Russia feels threatened by this expanding Chinese influence. And I think it's fair to ask whether it factored into the calculus behind Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. I know that is definitely outside the bubble of Washington think, but the possibility that Russia is more concerned about China than it is about NATO and the United States is a very real possibility for anybody who's traveled extensively in that part of the world, as I know everybody on this panel has. So that's why I'm bringing it up. And it could be that Russia's recognition of great power competition to come between the US and China, or the US and its allies on one side and China on the other, that Russia wanted to show both sides that it's not going to stand by while its own interests get swallowed up by China or by US-aligned Western powers. When we look at it from that context and we add the long history of strategic mistrust between Moscow and Beijing, I think there's reason to be skeptical of any narrative that China and Russia are about to become close military or other allies. So finally, now to my question for General Kellogg, and really I put this to all three of you, Ambassador DeTrani, Ambassador Joseph as well. Do you see China and Russia truly aligning because of Ukraine, or is it more likely that Beijing sees an opportunity here to exert its economic instrument of power over Russia, now that the Russian economy, Russian energy, fossil fuels, you name it, are being blacklisted by Europe and the United States and others? Isn't it likely that Beijing may seek to become Russia's biggest customer with in exchange for some concessions, perhaps one being lower prices for everything China wants, number one, but also perhaps in exchange for access to Russian military technologies, sensitive ones, hypersonics, and some strategic assets that we were just talking about. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this, and I'm also interested in the prospect of China's role as an interlocutor in whatever negotiation ultimately does come to the fore in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
So why don't we go right to General Kellogg on that, and then to Ambassador Joseph? General.
Yeah, it's a great comment. Look, I think China looks at all of us, to include Russia, as rookies in this. They think things, look at things strategically over a timeline. You know, they go back to the Ming Dynasty and before. They're talking about 300 or 400 BC, and they look at us and after a couple hundred years ago, you guys are really kind of rookies when it comes to all of this. And they look at everything strategically, and they look at things long term. We don't. We don't have we just don't have the ability to do that. It's almost like we're an ADD society. And I think we looked at the Chinese and the Trump administration as the primary threat, as the adversary that we were going to have to address well in the future, both economically and militarily and diplomatically. And that was a concern. And I think Xi had a handshake, and I think he's probably regretting today the handshake they had with Putin based on what has happened right now with Russia and Ukraine. But they're kind of looking at dominance, and they're not looking at it as a partnership with Russia. I don't think they look at that as probably in a level of expedience that is said, okay, we'll just kind of worry about this later on. Nothing major. This is the nation that uses debt diplomacy better than any other nation in the world. This is the nation that has established a seaport on the western part of Africa. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a Russian and Chinese fleet, primarily a Chinese fleet, operating in the Atlantic Ocean within the next decade. And this is the way the Chinese are. The Chinese are looking for dominance. And I don't think they look at a parity between them and the Russians at all. I think they look at them as it's expedient, and it'll be conditions based, and it all depends on the conditions being that which President Xi wants. I don't think Putin realizes that, or maybe he does, because his focus has continued to be, he meaning Putin. He's been so concerned about NATO, where China, on the other hand, looks at it global. And I don't think the Russians do that at all.
Ambassador Joseph?
Well, if I could just very briefly on 3 points that have been raised. The first, Joe, you mentioned tactical nuclear weapons, also called non-strategic nuclear weapons, which, if there ever was an oxymoron, I think that's it, because the use of any nuclear weapon is going to be strategic. Think of the use of one nuclear weapon by a terrorist against the United States. Profoundly change how we interact in the world. Second, in terms of Putin, there's a lot of discussion about how he's not only isolated, which I believe he is, but that he's become irrational. I don't buy into that. My direct experience with Putin goes back to a meeting in the Kremlin in October of 2001, right after September 11th. And this was a much different Putin. This was a Putin telling Don Rumsfeld that the Soviet Union had made any number of strategic errors in going into Afghanistan. And he was warning us not to make the same errors. Much different Putin than the Putin of today. But what he demonstrated in that conversation, and I reported to my boss after the meeting, was Putin is all about power. It's about power. It's about the use of power to achieve objectives. And third, in terms of Russia, China, I certainly agree with General Kellogg. I think this is a relationship of expediency, of convenience, certainly no lost love between the two, certainly a great number of suspicions between the two, certainly a Chinese desire to basically make Russia a vassal state through the economic interrelationships. But I think they are united. They are united in their opposition to the United States. They're united in their view, and it's really a zero-sum sort of view of their relationship with the United States for both of them. If the US wins, they lose. If they win, the US loses. And I think our approach ought to be to find and to exploit divisions in that relationship. I don't think we've done a very good job to date of doing that, but I think that is the best approach for the future.
Thank you, Ambassador Joseph. Let me make one comment and then pose a question to all of you. Further to your comments, Guy, and I like your question about China, Russia, and that relationship. My personal view is there is innate tension in that relationship. It's historical tension in that relationship. Most recently in Kazakhstan, we saw that China was moving very, very closely to Central Asia in a lot of ways. They're certainly doing it in Siberia. So if you're sitting in Moscow, you got to be a little concerned about, as Ambassador Joseph said, of becoming a vassal state of China if you're Russia, and you're totally dependent on that. So that's a piece of the equation. But there is a marriage of convenience here, and that marriage speaks to both countries viewing the U.S. as an adversary. And then I want to propose this. And in what sense an adversary? This is competition between autocracies and the despots and liberal democracies, the rule of law, freedom of speech. This has got to be very stark out there and so forth. So if there's one convergence, I could see China and Russia converging on the autocracy side and saying, my God, we're competing with, and we're seeing this in spades with the European Union and with all other countries coming together to sanction Russia, to condemn Russia for what they've been doing and what they're doing in this war in Ukraine. So I think it's materialized in that way, and that's where those two countries come together because they see that onslaught. So having said that, let me pose this question here. There is a North Korea in this equation. And the North Korea, and Ambassador Joseph mentioned this, and certainly General Kellogg, you mentioned that also in passing, that North Korea has nuclear weapons. North Korea has been telling us security assurances don't really mean that very much because it's a piece of paper. You could tear it up. And we want to denuclearize, we have to rebuild something. It will take decades. It takes billions of dollars and so forth. So if I was sitting in Beijing, I'd be sitting on a dilemma. One is the European Union countries have come together to condemn Russia for what they're doing. And we are now supporting Russia. What does that do for China in their Belt and Road Initiative? What does it do for them to keep that relationship with the European countries and certainly with the United States, the number 1 and 2 trading partners? So there's a conundrum there. And then you have a North Korea, and you're the only country aligned with a North Korea. And they're threatening the South, they're threatening Japan. And Kim Jong-un just recently today said they would use nuclear weapons if the South did something towards them that they felt was a threat. So let me pose this question to maybe 1 minute from all of you, and I'll start with General Kellogg. General, how do you see China in this equation dealing with this? Do you see China trying to mediate this so that they can sort of end this war, which I think is causing them a lot of grief because they've, as you said and Bob Joseph said very clearly, they've aligned themselves now with the revanchist Russia that has turned the world against them, a pariah state. I don't think China wants to be a pariah state. How do you see them managing this relationship?
Yeah, a great question. I think what they like what they're saying and like what they're saying because they would prefer us to continue to be a European facing nation and worry about NATO. And my point has all along been we shouldn't worry so much about NATO as we should about the Far East. As long as we're focused in on the European environment in that area, that gives China a lot of leeway in what they want to do. You know, our counterbalance in the Far East at the time under the Trump administration was, trying to get Japan to change their constitution on becoming creating not just a self-defense force, but actually a decent military. And also getting Kim Jong-un to be kind of at least in the middle. We told him repeatedly on Kim Jong-un that he's only the third member of his family that's been in power. That dynasty can fail pretty fast. And we're trying to get him on an economic side to at least consider something much different than he was working and be in line with China instead of driving him to China's hand. Continue to create that wedge to cause problems for the Chinese in their theater. That's the reason we work so hard to work with at that time with Korea. With Vietnam as well, and actually placing potentially a naval battle group in the Trang or Cam Ranh Bay or someplace like that, just to keep the pressure on the Chinese. So bottom line, I'll close it with this. I think the Chinese are happy that we're still engaged in Europe. The fact that we haven't been able to pivot to the Far East and focus on them it's just quite all right with them as they continue to build up their forces and continue to force the hand. Remember, this is the same nation, and with President Xi, that promised the United States of America and promised that time President Obama in the Rose Garden in public statements that he would never fortify the islands in the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands. He went ahead and did it. And as long as we don't focus in on the Far East, it's okay by him.
Thank you, General Kellogg. Ambassador Joseph.
Well, just very quickly, Joe, I think that we have to go back to what President Xi has stated as the #1 priority for China in the future, and that is to replace the United States as the preeminent power in the Asia Pacific as an intermediate step in acquiring the status as the #1 world power. And I certainly agree with General Kellogg. I think down in Europe, keeping us from pivoting our capabilities and our attention to the Asia Pacific to counter China's growth is perceived as in Chinese interest. All along, China has been undertaking a massive conventional and nuclear force buildup and has shifted, in my view, the correlation of forces, to use an old Soviet term, in favor of China. And I think that right now, even though there are difficulties in the China-Russia relationship, even though China may not want to be perceived as a pariah state, they're willing to accept those costs as long as it contributes to the strategic objective of moving the United States out of the Asia Pacific and replacing us as the premier power.
Thank you, Ambassador Joseph. Guy, we'll give you the last minute, Guy. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the question of how the Ukraine dynamic ultimately impacts the North Korea crisis is a really good one. Does it strategically benefit North Korea? Does it prompt Kim Jong-un to act in some way or resist acting in some way? These are incredibly difficult questions given the black box nature of the Kim regime. But what I think we know is that Pyongyang is very closely monitoring what happens in Ukraine and how the world reacts to Russia and what Russia is doing in Ukraine. The US and Europe and a handful of other democratic powers are putting sanctions on Russia. We have to understand that there are already sanctions all over the North Korean economy. I think the North Koreans are watching very closely to see how the rest of the world reacts if China bails Russia out economically, because you could foresee a dynamic of North Korea doing something where its one partner, China, comes to its rescue and doesn't face secondary sanctions, can still buy North Korean coal, can still evade sanctions and get away with it. So I don't have the answers to these questions. I just raise them because I think it's very prescient for us to ask, how are the North Koreans seeing this, and how might what's happening in Ukraine affect one of the really most complicated security dynamics in the human species, which is this nuclear armed North Korea isolated regime. So that's really it with that is the questions. As the journalist in the group, the questions are really the most important thing to me.
Thank you so much, Guy. That was excellent comments. Look, let me just say what a great discussion. And this is the value of these monthly webinars that we have with the Washington Times Foundation on the Washington Brief. We have so many issues out there that touch the national security, not only of the United States, but all of our allies and partners. And we as a leader need to be unpacking these issues and showing the leadership and discussing them to bring the American public totally informed, well informed on them. And this is what we do each month. And I want to thank certainly General Kellogg, Ambassador Bob Joseph, and our dear friend Guy Kayla. And over to you, Dr. Michael Jenkins. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador DeTrani. A beautiful job as moderator with your wisdom and experience, extensive experience, ongoing experience dealing with these kinds of challenges, especially your relationship with China and also with North Korea. We really appreciate your leadership. And Ambassador Robert Joseph, It's just an honor to have you here on this program. We learned a lot today. And Mr. Guy Taylor, your articles and your insights are incredible. And we can't thank you enough also for giving your insights here, especially that there might be a gap between China and Russia opening up. And General Kellogg, you came with the highest recommendations from our dear friend Speaker Gingrich, and we really thank you for your leadership today and the insights you have that really help us understand we are in a very serious challenge to our republic and to the principles for which we stand. And that's why the Washington Brief seeks to strengthen America, strengthen our commitment to our founding principles, and also the understanding that peace through strength is really, really important. But it also has to be one where we build consensus and unity based on God affirming principles that see that evil and destruction cannot be allowed to stand. We do believe we will overcome these challenges, but only when great leaders like we have on this program today are able to engage all the different leaders of our administration as well as the world. And many of you have been part of this administration. Some of you are currently advising this administration. So we want to help our administration. And we're glad that this topic of really understanding that the real most serious situation of all is the fact that China has a global long-term plan. I think that that cannot be ignored for a moment. And we are most concerned about Northeast Asia. We're very deeply troubled about resolving this problem with Ukraine being invaded by Russia, the horrific situation there. And we do believe that there is a way to go forward, but only if America leads, only if America finds that kind of substance we had when we finally could understand that we had to step into World War II. There was no way to avoid it any longer. And we don't want a world war. That will not solve the problem. But I think we need leadership right now, especially Northeast Asia. I think the Chinese and also the North Koreans are very keen about what America will do and how America handles this. And if America remains strong and handles it wisely with commitment and unwavering commitment to the freedom of all people and rules-based governance and law, I think that we will triumph. But it's going to take your leadership to all of the panelists here. We really, really need you. And fact you, Ambassador DeTrani. We always learn from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Many fact finders together to Korea. And that we'll be doing another one this summer. And we're going to continue now that the pandemic has gone down. And we do want to directly engage with China and North Korea. Our foundations do have very good connections there. We want to continue to engage with Russia also. And we pray for Ukraine. And we want to thank you all for this program. All of our audience will be here again on May 3rd, the first Tuesday of every month. And in the interim, every Tuesday, we have a webinar that is also addressing the issues of security and peace in the world. Mr. Moffett, thank you a lot for your great leadership of the Washington Times Foundation.
Thank you, Michael.